There was a time not too long ago when the name Final Fantasy commanded more or less universal respect. A new Final Fantasy game would definitely sell a few million copies in the US, Japan, and Europe. Not a few million overall, but in each region. Times have changed. These days, Final Fantasy still has its fans, and it remains arguably the most popular RPG series in the world. But sales often fail to break into that rarefied millions territory unless you count every region cumulatively. The shine is off its star, and it's hard to imagine any future entry in the series ever commanding the sense of importance that Final Fantasy VII did more than a decade and a half ago. Perhaps no single event better demonstrates the troubled times into which Final Fantasy has fallen than what happened this February, when the big-budget sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning Returns, launched in the US alongside Bravely Default. And Bravely Default promptly trounced it in terms of sales. Bravely Default, of course, was a portable game that began life as a Final Fantasy spin-off, only to change its branding midway through. Square Enix had so little confidence in its US prospects that they left publishing duties to Nintendo, and yet it outperformed Lightning Returns quite handily, despite the latter wearing prominent Final Fantasy branding. Now, the end is hardly nigh for Final Fantasy. The spectacular-looking, big-budget, next-generation action RPG Final Fantasy XV has quite a few people entranced, but neither does the series command the respect it once did. So how has it come to this? How did Final Fantasy fall from grace? Many people will point to Final Fantasy XIII as the series' turning point, but that's an oversimplification. The troubles surrounding FF13 certainly make for the highest profile example of Square Enix's misstep with the series, but in many ways, FF13 was merely a symptom of a much larger problem. What really happened was that the nature of video games changed, and Final Fantasy, or rather Square Enix, didn't adapt quickly enough. They're hardly alone in that. Several longtime Japanese publishers took it on the chin during the last hardware generation. I mean, just look at where Konami and Capcom are these days. Back in the day, Final Fantasy VII set a new high watermark for the visual fidelity of video games as a whole, combining blockbuster visuals with meaty RPG mechanics. Before that, RPGs tended to look pretty primitive. It was unusual to see a game that huge and that pretty all at once. This became Final Fantasy's trademark: great RPG depth, gorgeous cutting-edge visuals. But over time, other games managed to match Final Fantasy's visual panache, and then they started to integrate RPG elements into more accessible, faster-paced genres. Eventually, shooters and other action games looked even better than Final Fantasy, told equally involved stories, and offered equally addictive character growth mechanics. So where did that leave Final Fantasy? Square Enix's approach to this looming obsolescence was to do what Final Fantasy does best: change things up every time, and always strive for the most elaborate presentation and story imaginable. The problem is that while games didn't grow much more complex or difficult to design between the PlayStation and PlayStation 3 eras, the resources needed to create those high-end visuals increased exponentially. For Final Fantasy XII on PlayStation 2, 70% of the game's resources went into art. For Final Fantasy XIII, that percentage grew even higher. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn director Naoki Yoshida admitted the company's quote-unquote unhealthy obsession with graphics derailed the original version of Final Fantasy XIV. As he pointed out, a single piece of scenery in Final Fantasy XIV contained as much graphical detail as a player's character, a waste of both human and processor resources. That was also the case for Final Fantasy XIII. That famous anecdote about an artist working on creating a single rock for 2 weeks because she had no other instructions may or may not be apocryphal, but it is a hard fact that nearly half the artwork and environments created for FF13 ended up being thrown out. The game ran badly over deadline, yet nearly half the effort and money poured into it ended up on the cutting room floor. Part of the problem seems to have been that Final Fantasy XIII's creators weren't quite sure what they wanted the game to be. Director Motomo Toriyama tells me, the debut trailer shown at E3 in 2006 was created to depict the concept of Final Fantasy XIII. The concept of Lightning as the female protagonist, and the fast-paced active time battle system had already been decided by then. Of course, as the trailer was shown to a global audience, we worked to visualize what we would consider as a goal for the final game, instead of showing the early development stage of the game. In other words, the 13 team showed off what they wanted the game to look and feel like, then spent several years trying to figure out how that would translate to an actual game. Both Yoshida and Toriyama admit that the creative process behind the past decade's worth of Final Fantasy has been ill-suited to the needs of contemporary game design. Again, Toriyama says, when we were developing Final Fantasy XIII, a large-scale team was starting the pre-production while the game engine was being developed at the same time. This was because we relied on past experience, making estimations without clearly defining milestones, and not restricting the team structure with each development phase. It wouldn't have been an issue if the game was an extension of a past project. But you see, unlike most major hits of the past decade, Square Enix insisted on developing its own technology for Final Fantasy XIII, rather than licensing an engine, like Epic's Unreal. Not only did that incur a tremendous amount of research and development cost, it also meant the folks designing the actual game content had to guess at what the tech would ultimately be capable of. Really, the series' problems began in earnest with Final Fantasy XII, a game that ran horribly past deadline after its director, Yasumi Matsuno, had to leave production midway through for health reasons. Final Fantasy XIII was actually supposed to have been a PS2 game, but when FF12 came in a couple of years after its intended launch date, Final Fantasy XIII had to be moved to HD, which meant of course that it became a much more expensive game. Toriyama says, "Elements relating to the lore and story that were created for the PlayStation 2 version of Final Fantasy XIII were kept as is, but we redesigned technical elements such as graphics, battle system, and game mechanics to specifically match the next generation console specs. Naturally, we had to build a brand new engine from scratch as the basis of the game, which was then tuned specifically for the next gen console. Building the foundation of the engine alone took several years." So basically what you have is a cascading domino effect. One game was late and it affected everything to come after. FF12 was a great game, but it sure made a mess of the series. And if Final Fantasy XIII and XIV were the end of the Final Fantasy story, things would look grim indeed for the franchise. But the series' main creative leads have made a concerted effort to turn the ship around in the past few years. A Realm Reborn definitely stands as the company's most impressive achievement. Yoshida's team took a laughingstock of an MMO and completely reinvented it into something that fans and newcomers alike love. Meanwhile, the Final Fantasy XIII team has been casting about for direction, using that game's sequels as a testbed for experimentation and discovery. While Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns haven't sold that well, and have been largely dismissed by many gamers, they also demonstrate a valuable willingness to reinvent the series while trying to preserve its essence. Lightning Returns, for instance, definitely has significant elements of Final Fantasy XIII in its DNA. Not just the characters and monsters that appear, but also ideas like paradigm shifts and damage limit breaking. Yet it turns a linear, menu-driven RPG series into an open-world action game. Final Fantasy XIII producer Yoshinori Kitase seems particularly keen to win back American fans, having solicited feedback directly from people like the US gamer readership, to get a sense of what overseas players want from their combat systems, from their localization, from Final Fantasy remakes, and more. Really, at this point, the only relic of the old Final Fantasy approach is Final Fantasy XV, which of course began life as a spin-off of Final Fantasy XIII. While FF15 looks spectacular, it's been in development for 8 years, making it precisely the sort of laborious development process Square is trying to move away from. Will 15 be worth it? What does the future hold for the series beyond that? Can Square win back disinterested players? What would it take to bring you back to the Final Fantasy fold? Share your thoughts in the comments, and of course, keep reading usgamer.net. Or else.